Good day, everybody in Alaska. This is Eric Holloway with the National Weather Service with Alaska Weather. We have a couple options for you, a 1-800 number that you can get through a menu system to help you check out your weather in your area of concern. We also put all our information online at weather.gov/Alaska, and you can take off Alaska and put in Fairbanks, Juneau, or Anchorage, again to further help you refine your search. Looking at the hazards map today, we do have a flood advisory out still for the Ward Lake area. There's some high water around the lake and also down below the lake where it's flooding a trail system below the dam there, and no homes or structures are being impacted, but there is a campground that's got some water in it as well. Also, we do have the warning out for sleep mute continuing in the sleep mute area. I suspect that might be taken off here in the next couple hours, so please look up the hazards map again for the most current information, but for right now the warning is still going on there at sleep mute. And otherwise, weather-wise, there's not much going on statewide, just very nice weather across the state, especially across the mainland. For the breakup map, we're still waiting for the Yukon River at Dawson to go out. Last evening, the camera still there showed still that there was still large sheets and pans in place. Most of the activity again has been limited to the Tanana Basin. I was looking at water levels on the Chena, and they look to be coming down a little bit as well. There is some openings there just above Tanana, but otherwise the only real activity has been the ice jam just below sleep mute there, and Nikolai up in the upper part of the Kuskokwim Basin. Otherwise, the Copper River has been doing some various activities there. We've got mostly open depicted in that basin. For the satellite image, you can see a large low out there in the Aleutians with an occluded front out ahead of it there, moving through the eastern portions of the Aleutian. You can also see some fog out there, especially just off the coast of the YK Delta into Norton Sound, across into St. Lawrence Island. Otherwise, there's a nice low pressure system, scattered precipitation out ahead of that across the Panhandle. Otherwise, mixed precipitation as you move further inland. But otherwise, across the mainland, again, pretty nice conditions. We'll set this in motion again, and you can see very nice conditions across the region. For today's weather map, you can see a 987 millibar low with mixed precipitation across the Bering Sea and into the Aleutians with rain showers down that way. Stationary front across the mainland and into Canada. Light mixed precipitation across eastern interior and into Canada. Otherwise, rain showers across much of the Panhandle and down into Canada. For tonight's weather, looking at a 991 millibar low, again moving slowly eastward. There now a trough as it approaches Alaska Peninsula, clouds through much of the Bering Sea. Rain showers through portions of the eastern Aleutians, otherwise rain showers south of the Aleutians there, and showers again as you move over to the southeast, with mixed precipitation and snow showers further inland across Canada. Otherwise, clear skies tonight across the mainland. And Thursday's weather, that low weakens further in the Aleutians, troughs circling around that low, mixed precipitation. Otherwise, a trough bringing some chances for clouds across south central, mixed precipitation in the southeast interior, rain showers across the Panhandle, and mixed precipitation as you get into Yukon Territory and British Columbia. Otherwise, again, pretty clear conditions across the mainland. For Friday's weather, that low now, 1003 millibar low in the central Aleutians with mixed precipitation around that system. Otherwise, a low over into Canada at 1011 millibar low as it reaches into Canada and mixed precipitation associated with that system. Otherwise, the ridge of high pressure remains dominant across the state of Alaska. Low temperatures this morning for Thursday morning, negative readings across the Arctic coast for Thursday morning, single digits and teens across the northwest part of the state, otherwise teens and single digits across the interior, and Eagle 7, Fort Yukon 13, teens as you get over into Kotzebue with 16, 22 on the south side of the Seward Peninsula with 22, and then as we get into the interior, 20 degrees there by Thursday morning in Fairbanks, and 30s and upper 20s as you get into the southern part of the mainland. Looks like Bethel's going to be around 25, 20 degrees there in McGrath, 32 in Anchorage, 40 in Cordova, 34 in Homer, Kodiak 38, and 30s across the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutians, 40s in the Panhandle. For Thursday afternoon, we're going to be looking at teens and single digits across the North Slope, 30s and 40s across the midsection of the state, and 40s and 50s as we get in the southern part of the mainland with 52 in Anchorage, Dillingham 49, Bethel 40, 45 in McGrath, and 50 at Cordova, and 40s through Alaska Peninsula and into the Aleutian Chain, 40s in the Panhandle. For Thursday morning, or Friday morning, I'm sorry, just below zero readings there on the Arctic coast, and single digits up that way. Northwest coast 11 at 13 at Point Hope, and Kotzebue 16, 22 at Nome, Fort Yukon 18, 16 in Eagle, otherwise 20s across the midsection, and then 30s as you get into the southern mainland, 27 in Bethel, 34 in Anchorage, 40 at Cordova, Valdez 40, Yakutat 38, and 40s in the Panhandle, 36 in Kodiak, and 30s through the Alaska Peninsula and down through the chain. And finally, for Friday afternoon, we're going to be seeing teens across the Arctic coast, 20s across the northwest part of the coast, Point Hope 29, Kotzebue 31, Ambler 36, Fort Yukon 38, 36 in Eagle, 40s across the midsection of the state with Fairbanks 45, McGrath 45, Aniak 49, and 40 in Bethel. And then we're going to be looking for 49 in Dillingham, 52 in King Salmon, and 40s through the Panhandle, maybe in a 50.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Taking a look at the flying weather for Thursday morning, we've got some marginal conditions across the Brooks Range. And out in the Bering Sea, associated with the included front, IFR conditions along that frontal boundary and IFR conditions around the low. Out in the western Aleutians, otherwise marginal and IFR conditions near the Panhandle. With the weakening low there, that marginal condition spreads into the Chugach Range and southeast interior. For Thursday afternoon, marginal conditions showing up there on the Arctic coast. Otherwise, the occluded front weakens to a trough now, but still IFR conditions out there in the Bering. Approaching marginal conditions in the Bristol Bay area, and then marginal and IFR conditions there along the Gulf Coast region. Marginal conditions improving down there in the Panhandle. And for Friday morning, around a high pressure ridge in the Chukchi Sea, IFR conditions there in the North Slope Arctic coast, and then still weakening conditions bringing marginal and IFR conditions for much of the Bering Sea, and IFR conditions show up there in the Bristol region and Kuskokwim Bay. Otherwise, IFR conditions in the Gulf, with again improving conditions down in the southeast. For Friday afternoon, IFR conditions again, slightly improving conditions there on the Arctic coast. Otherwise, IFR conditions continuing into the southwest coastal areas. Marginal conditions throughout much of the Bering and Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. And lastly, in the northern Gulfs, continued IFR and marginal conditions. Otherwise, the Panhandle improves drastically by Friday afternoon. Looking at the past conditions, Anaktuva went for marginal VFR conditions there. VFR and Adigan improving conditions as you move eastward. And all the passes in south central look to be pretty nice. Lake Clark and Merrill VFR, rainy VFR, windy VFR, Isabel VFR, Mentasta VFR, Tenida VFR, Portage VFR, but we did analyze some marginal conditions in the eastern entrance. And Chilkoot and White Passes, like we mentioned, IFR conditions improving the marginal conditions by later in the day. Freezing levels Thursday morning, surface comes across the Bering Sea and into Alaska Peninsula through south central and out through the Panhandle, much the same for the 2,000 foot level. Yet to get to, into the British Columbia area to get to 4,000 feet. Icing conditions above 5,000 feet there in the southeast, with that again weakening low pressure system, but otherwise isolated moderate through much of Canada into southeast interior, and also we have another area analyzed in the Aleutians with between 3,000 and 6,000 feet there, considerable moderate possible in the central Aleutians. Jet stream, we're going to be looking at 140 knot winds south of the Aleutians, well south of the Aleutians, but otherwise in the Aleutians, 45 or 50 knots there. As you get into the mainland, along the Arctic coast, 50 knots there, 65 as you get south of the Brooks Range, and even 45 as you get out to the YK Delta. St. Lawrence Island, maybe close to 75, 65, 75 knots there. Otherwise, 45 knots analyzed just south on the southern end of the Panhandle, and pretty weak and variable conditions across the southern mainland. 9,000 foot winds, 30 knot winds there in the middle Yukon territory. Otherwise, much of the mainland light and variable, and same for the southeast Panhandle area, and then get into more winds as you get it way out there in the Aleutians with 25 to 35 knots there, and just south of Aleutians 55 knots. And for 3,000 foot winds on Thursday, again that area in the middle Yukon, 35 knots there around weakening low, 35 knots in the northern Panhandle, and around the low again out in the Aleutians, 50 knots there, just in the western Aleutians, 40s and 35 as you get move east across Aleutians. And moving on to turbulence.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining me once again is Eric Stevens from the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, or GINA, based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Well, Dave, it's great to be back. Thanks for inviting us again.
Sure thing. And today we want to talk about identifying burn scars. That would be the burned up area after a wildfire when the flames and the smoke are gone. We can see it if you drive by it on the roadway, of course, but from satellite we can also identify those places on the land, right?
You know it. You know that expression, ouch, that's going to leave a mark?
Yeah.
After you bang your knee getting out of the car.
Oh yeah.
Well, the ouch, it's going to leave a mark, that also applies to the landscape. Whenever a wildfire ravages through, it's going to leave a mark on the landscape. After a wildfire burns out, this is called a burn scar.
Okay.
And you can ask yourself, well, that's interesting. We can see a burn scar from space. Right. Then the question is, well, why does that matter?
Okay.
Who cares?
Yeah, fire's over.
Right, the fire is over. We don't need to worry about this anymore. It turns out you kind of do, because burn scars are important. there's this old rule of thumb in the weather business that flood follows fire.
Okay.
The action of the fire in killing off the vegetation, in baking, kiln drying the landscape a little bit, can hinder the land's ability to absorb rainfall. So if you have a fire, especially if it's in complex mountainous terrain.
Right.
This is classic in California. It can happen somewhat in Alaska too. You get a wildfire in steep, hilly, or mountainous terrain, rips off all the vegetation off the landscape. Then 6 months later, there's a big rainstorm, and you get a flash flood in that area. So flood can follow fire. That's why you got to know where the burn scars are. Secondly, a fire needs fuel to maintain itself. So if there's an old burn scar left over from a year or two ago, and then another summer later here in Alaska in the interior, it's a big wildfire season. If there's a fire advancing toward an old burn scar, well, guess what? That old burn scar is going to be tougher terrain for that new fire to get through because there's not as much fuel in that burn scar. So they almost act like a natural fire break. These are a couple of reasons why you need to know where those burn scars are. Alaska Fire Service has limited resources. They want to put their people and their equipment where it does the most good. They need to know, well, this is an area where there's no burn scar. We better put people here because that fire could really run.
So really important for weather forecasters and fire weather forecasters for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But then how do weather satellites actually detect those burn scars?
Ah, good question.
Thanks.
Well, let's turn the Wayback Machine to the summer of 2015. That was a very active year. We've got a picture here taken up in the White Mountains. This is one of the fires in progress that summer, and if you look real close, you can almost see Frodo throwing the ring into the volcano there. So that's quite the vision. Well, let's look at a visible image. Here we are in Alaska's interior. This is before the fires got out of the cage in early summer of 2015. Let's zoom into the western interior here. Again, this is a weather satellite image of visible light, what the human eye can see. We're into the middle reach of the Yukon Valley there in the western interior, Galena area. And this is just a beautiful visible day. Nothing much going on. It's in early June before the fires really got active. But then in 2015, the fires got loose, especially in that western interior. Here's another image. The same satellite pass as that visible image, but now we're not quite looking at visible light.
Very different.
There's a slight change here. This image incorporates something called the veggie band. 0.86 micron wavelength. The micron's very tiny, but that wavelength responds to vegetation, the chlorophyll. So trees and grasses reflect that part of the electromagnetic spectrum back to the satellite. And so the satellite sees that. When signal comes at that wavelength to the satellite, we know, there's some vegetation growing there. This is great. You can identify coastlines so easily because you go from vegetation to water. Turns out if you have a burn scar, guess what? You burned away the vegetation, so that's going to show up. We're going to do a before, during, and after kind of look here. And so we're looking at before. So in this image, we got a lot of green out there. That's wonderful. Another fun thing about this kind of imagery is you can see down in the Alaska Range in the southeast corner of the image, it's blue. That's glaciers and snow in the mountains. So this is not really what the human eye can see. This is these wavelengths are beyond human vision, but we've made them look certain colors. So the vegetation looks green. Now let's look at that same kind of satellite recipe, but during the fires. This is in July. The fires are loose. You can see the smoke in the middle of the image, the smearing look of the smoke, and then we can see some clouds that are white. Icy clouds are blue. So this is in July of 2015. The fires are doing their thing. We're burning up millions of acres. Now let's go to September. The fires are out. The audience has left the theater. You know, the event's over, right? We're done. But guess what? Now look at those brown patches.
Look at that.
All of those places are where the fire has burned away the vegetation. So you can see where the fires were. You can add up these perimeters, get acreage burned and such. And so that's good to know. Now remember, flood follows fire, and these are also natural fire breaks. So you need to know where these guys are. In the course of the 2015 summer season, we went from before with not much burn scar in this area to just a couple months later, we can see so much burn scarring on the landscape. What's interesting too about the satellite and looking at burn scars is you realize that burn scars are the gift that keeps on giving. You can forget that a couple of years ago maybe there was a fire in a certain area, but the satellite won't forget. So in the summertime we get wildfires in Alaska, but guess what? In the visible imagery here we can see the burn scars just a little bit, but they're not as prominent as in that veggie band. but then you can't see them at all if you cover them up with snow, right?
Exactly.
So here's an image from the middle of the winter time.
Wow.
And snow on the ground by this recipe looks blue. Again, these are wavelengths of light that the human eye can't really see. We're getting up into the infrared, near infrared. And the way we've assigned colors is if there's snow on the ground or there's a glacier, it looks blue, kind of intuitive. So this is early April of the following year, 2016.
Okay.
We're just about to get into breakup. We've got a lot of snow on the ground, and now it's all going to melt. And as the snow melts, then you get our final image here. Doesn't this look familiar? This looks like a lot of what we saw in September of the previous summer. So this is the spring of the next year. The fires themselves might not have overwintered, they're gone, but the fire scar does. And as the snow melts away, and then you have breakup, and then you have green up, whenever the leaves come out, the grass comes back, except in the burned areas, they're having a tough time because everything got burned off the previous year. So you can see these scars even the next summer, multiple years. It depends on what kind of vegetation there is. You know, some of the tussocky tundra grasses, they'll grow back really quick, but to get a forest to come back, that'll take much longer. So these burn scars, eventually the landscape will fill in the burn scar. It will heal itself, if you want to use that metaphor. But for the next few years, you can still keep track of these on satellite. And again, the reason we want to do that is that the burn scar can facilitate a flood, and it can act like a fire break. So there you are, the
fascinating tools. So if you're a weather satellite and you're looking at my bowl of vegetables here, you might be able to pick out which one's the pea, which one's the tomato, and which one's the carrot, and apply that information precisely to whatever it is you're working on there. That is really fascinating stuff, that we have that capability from so high above the planet Earth, and Alaska for that matter.
Eric? Eat your veggies.
Yes, definitely. I think I will. I'm hungry. Thanks so much for joining us again, Eric, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We'll see you right here next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For our marine forecast, we'll start off with our ice edge. We do see some of the ice along the leading ice edge continuing to break off. We also have polynyas forming, especially on the south side of a lot of areas. We do have some of the winds still in there starting to build or expand those polynyas. However, when the winds calm down, we do expect it to be cold enough, especially those cold water temps, to have some new ice form within the polynyas. But over the next few days, we expect primarily for the polynyas to open up again, especially on the southern side of land areas. We also have some of our shorefast ice starting to break up. As we saw yesterday on the north side of the Kuskokwim Delta area, a large chunk of ice broke off from the shorefast. So keep that in mind as we are continuing to go into the breakup season and get into warmer temperatures, that polynyas are going to continue to expand, and we do have some of the shorefast ice also starting to break up now as well. Take a look now in southeast Alaska starting on Thursday. Inside waters, we do have south to southeast flow, 15 to 25 knots is expected, strongest as we get to the central and northern locations. Then out over the Gulf, southerly winds, 15 to 20 knots is expected, seas as high as 9 feet. On Friday, flow becoming more east to northeast for the Gulf areas, northern locations at 15 knots, southern locations at 25 knots. Then in the inside waters, north winds 10 knots are expected, with the exception of the southern inside waters, as we will get to southeasterly winds at 15 knots. For south central Alaska, out in the Cook Inlet area, north to northeast winds 10 to 15 knots. North winds 15 knots as we get closer to Kamishak Bay, and then out over the Gulf, variable winds around 10 knots, getting up to as high as 15 knots out of the south as we get further to the northeast. Then in Prince William Sound, easterly winds 10 knots is expected. Staying out over the Gulf areas, easterly winds 15 knots expected for Friday. In Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 10 knots. In Cook Inlet area, northerly winds 10 knots. And then to the west of the Barren Islands, northeast winds 15 knots are expected. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting by Kodiak Island, southwesterly winds 15 knots. Staying on the Pacific side, out of the west, 15 knots is expected for the peninsula. Then on the Bering side, variable winds 10 knots are expected. Seas as high as 6 feet to the south of the peninsula. Then on Friday, still weaker winds, primarily around 10 knots out of an east to northeast direction. And then a little bit stronger in Shelikof Strait, northeast winds 15 knots expected there. Seas up to as high as 6 feet, strongest or highest on the south side of the peninsula. For Thursday, for the Aleutian Islands, and west to southwest winds, Starting off in the east, weaker winds around 10 to 15 knots, getting up to as high as 30 knots as we get closer towards the western Aleutians. Then on Friday, still primarily out of a westerly to northwest direction for the western Aleutians at 25 knots, seas up to as high as 11 feet now for the western Aleutians, becoming more southerly as we push off further to the east, and winds diminishing from 15 knots near much of the central Aleutians down to 10 knots by the eastern Aleutians, and seas up to as high as 11 feet for the central Aleutians on the Pacific side. Along the west coast of the state, staying right along the coastline, we have flows starting off the northeasterly direction for northern locations, becoming more northwesterly as we drop down by the Nunavik Island area, 10 to 15 knots expected. Then out by St. Matthew Island and the Pribilof Islands, southeasterly winds around 10 knots. Seas up to as high as 8 feet by St. Matthew Island. Then on Friday, still weaker winds for much of the area, 10 to 15 knots at all locations along the west coast. But we do have some varying directions. Out over St. Matthew Island area, northeasterly winds by the Pribilofs, northerly winds by Nunavik Island, southeasterly winds, and then out of Norton Sound and by St. Lawrence Island, northeasterly winds are expected. For Thursday, along the Arctic coastline, we have easterly winds, strongest by the Beaufort Sea, 25 knots there, dropping down to 15 knots by AKwx, and then down much of the northwest coastline, we have southerly winds 10 knots, becoming east and then north around 15 as we approach the Bering Strait. For Friday, starting up along the Arctic coast, westerly winds 10 to 15 knots expected, then dropping us down as we get closer to the Kotzebue Sound area, becoming northeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots are expected. For the remainder of the night, we'll start with our low pressure system out by the western Aleutians, bringing a mix of rain and snow to the central and western Aleutians, then some rain for the eastern Aleutians from a weaker low to the south of the islands. Much of mainland Alaska not going to see any precipitation, fair weather expected in most locations, but then as we move out by the Panhandle area, we do have a low pressure system out over the eastern Gulf, bringing some rain to the Panhandle with some snow further to the north. As we move into Thursday, going to see continued rain and snow along much of the interior locations along the North Gulf Coast, with rain by the coastline, and a mix of rain and snow for the Aleutians.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.